think the capacity investment scheme is a broadly good move.
Together we can work in common interests with business and unions to drive productivity, to lift wages and profits. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around. Together, we can as a country say that all of us, if the Fair Work Commission don't cut the wage of minimum wage workers, we can say, will we welcome that? Absolutely.
Okay, so Labor advocating for the minimum wage is not a particularly... Again, it'd be shocking if Albanese came in and said nothing about that. Now, what I will draw your attention to is the real wage growth graph historically over time. So right here in the kind of highest graph that we have is CPI. Down here we have wage price index, and then if you minus CPI from wage price index, that gives us an indicator of what the real wage growth is, or annual real wage growth. And as you can see, as expected, you're always going to see, like, this does not look good for Labor in the sense that we're starting to see a little bit of real wage growth decline at the end of Scott Morrison's time, and then when Labor comes in the June 22 quarter, it plummets to really bad rates. So that does not look good if you just look at that side of the graph. What you need to pay attention to is CPI, because real wage growth is wage price index minus CPI, consumer price index as well, which gives you an indicator of, are your wages actually declining against inflation or are they not? Albanese has come in during record inflation, so of course your wages are going to be on the decline. That is something that is completely, I wouldn't say completely, largely outside the control of the government, in that inflation is usually a consequence of global economic issues. Same thing happened in the 70s. Gough Whitlam made this argument that when Whitlam was in, we were really badly affected by the stagflation that was kind of tearing through America in the 70s. What's important to note is actually what's happening to the trajectory here. Now, obviously, this is going to rise as CPI falls, but it's actually performing remarkably well against CPI, particularly as you're reaching the 2024 quarters. And actually, we're seeing consistent. So we've got, what have we got here? We've got 0.1, 4.1, and 0.1, 0.5, and 0.3. My bad. So we've got very small real wage growth increases, but we have got 3 consecutive real wage growth increases, and that's for the first time since back in 2020. And again, those wage growths, that was happening when CPI was actually at a negative rate as well. So you're going to see the real wage growth there, where CPI is actually in the negatives because you don't need to subtract it from WPI. Anyway, a lot of acronyms there. Basically, it's getting better. And real wages are starting to increase now. And I think there's a couple of reasons for it. What I will say is that holding the Albanese government accountable for inflation is really harsh. So again, we're affected by global economic conditions, but also at the same time, the main cause for inflation appears to be, again, I'm not an economist, so I'm going to tread with some caution here. My understanding of the inflation crisis is that it's primarily a corporate profits driven phenomenon, in the sense that the inflation has happened because, particularly off the back of COVID, mega corporations used it as a justification to hike up prices. Then they also used the Russia-Ukraine war to hike up prices. And actually the cost of your, packets of chicken crimpy shapes at Woolies was artificially put up in a way that wasn't actually affected by the supply chain like they said it was. Again, that's not a particularly profound point. We've all gotten a sense of, like, again, for the first time, public opinion has turned on Coles and Woolies that are seen as kind of staples of Australian culture. And again, they've got a huge market share, so they can afford to do that. I know Friendly Geordies did a video on it recently where he talked about the fact that Costco couldn't even break into the Australian supermarket game or anything like that. So you've got these titans of Australian retail that are doing these price gouging initiatives. And in your first term, the way that you could potentially reduce inflation is by taking them on and forcing them to reduce their prices. That is a massive move to take on these titans of Australian retail. And so I don't, like, again, if you kind of in my mind, have an unrealistic view of politics in the sense that you can just come in and kill these companies off and then bang, everything's fixed. Well, it's not. They've become so big that basically it would be killing a massive part of our economy off in a way that would do some quite serious damage, both in the short term, but then would have such serious damage in the short term that would spill over to some longer term effects too. And so what was it? Was the I only half watched the video that Friendly Geordie's put up, but I think he used the illustration of rather than dropping a nuke on cancer, you use chemotherapy. And that does appear to be what the Labor government's done with the Fruit and Grocery Code, which basically puts in fines for unfair monopoly style or oligarchy style practices. And so, there's been the institution of multi-million-dollar penalties should they fail to do that. For a lot of people, that's not a harsh enough consequence because they're wanting to either break up Coles or Woolies or do things like price freezes or something like that, or much heavier price controls than we're seeing. And it's a tough balancing act because that is the primary thing that's driving inflation. And so the best way that you can fix real wage growth is, yes, legislating for minimum wage increases, but also at the same time, if I go back to that initial graph, trying to kill or trying to reduce CPI by quite a fair bit, again, particularly when it's being driven by corporate profits rather than wage increases. And so the way to achieve real wage growth is by seeing this graph or this line right here drop. And the way that you do that is by crippling Coles and Woolies. But if you cripple Coles and Woolies, then you'll see unemployment rise as well. So you've got to have that balancing act of having them reform their practices rather than kill the institution. I do think that's the best approach. I think these titans are so big that the best strategy moving forward, both electorally but also practically for the economy, is to push for reform rather than revolution, which would be disappointing news to a lot of people and would be seen as cozying up with corporations. The reality is, just in terms of having a functioning economy, it has to be done to avoid seeing massive increases in unemployment. That's my opinion. So I'm saying that as though it's just fact. That is 100% my opinion. Far smarter people than me would disagree.